And here we are in Humboldt County as well. And I would say Humboldt County is now moving pretty aggressively toward this path. Do you want to talk about, Matthew, about where you're at?
Yeah, maybe just give a quick update. So Arcade has certainly been looking at it in depth for quite some time, and
not 10 years.
And then I think there's been interest in Humboldt for a while, but there was sort of a little bit of like, well, we want to be first. And then Marin said, oh, that looks promising, but they kind of suddenly got beat up by PG&E, and do we want that kind of fight on their hands? And then Sonoma kind of rolled their program out without kind of that level of opposition for many reasons, and kind of also was like, okay, if you can do it once, you can do it twice, probably do it 3 times. And so I think that was really when everyone said, okay, let's really take this seriously. And we kind of balancing other priorities last year, sort of looked at does this make sense? Do we have the scale? What are kind of the options versus joining Sonoma, Marin? Your guys' company didn't exist, and it wasn't like sort of the service provider. So we were kind of more heavily weighting like, does it make more sense to join an existing program? And Arcadis certainly was conducting on within that their own analysis. I would say more actively than we were. So we kind of the rest of the county is catching up to where Arcadis been for a while. And then basically the beginning of this year, my board, which is a representative from the board of supervisors in every city in the county, said, yeah, let's really actively, let's decide if we're going to do this year. It looks like it makes sense, so let's start doing the steps to actually pursue it. And then this summer, the board of supervisors kind of, got more engaged on the topic and saying, okay, yeah, let's actually, got excited about it, which was nice. Because before it was kind of like trying to convince people to be interested, and they sort of said, okay, let's do this. And my board committed a chunk of our general fund resources for this fiscal year to kind of cover our staff and legal costs and some of the effort on our side to move it forward. And then basically said, go forth and do this. And so the priorities that we're kind of operating under that our board has set, and I think have been resonating. I've gone and done presentations to every jurisdiction, and there's been, I think, a general consensus that those challenge these priorities, which are the rate has to be competitive or below where PG is at for it to be viable, and that's kind of a deal breaker if it's going to cost people a lot more to do it. But then after that, really, people have said, we want to prioritize local renewables. And not just for the environmental benefits, but also for the economic development benefits. And I think the biomass piece of it was mentioned, that we've got 3 biomass plants around here. 2 of them this summer actually idled because they didn't have. One of them had their contract bought out, and one of them basically their contract's not over yet, but the terms of it, they just couldn't make it pencil out. And the reason for that is it's fairly expensive, generation compared to other resources, and so if you're an investor-owned utility, it's not their job to care about the Humboldt County economy. It's their job to get cheap power and have profit for their shareholders, and and they're kind of legally required not to pay more than they need to, and so we're in a different position where those facilities are actually quite important to the forestry sector, and that biomass is really like a waste product from forestry operations, from fuel reduction efforts, from the primary source is mill waste that now has to be trucked out of the area because the one operating facility can't actually take all the material that's generated by local mills. And so it's a liability if we don't use it in biomass facilities, but obviously we use it, it's a resource there. And so that's been, I think, something that's resonated with kind of the broader spectrum of the community. There's folks in Rio Dell aren't necessarily like, all gung-ho about green power, although I wouldn't say that they are, sometimes people are, don't fit stereotypes. So, just because somebody's from a logging town doesn't mean that they, don't like renewable energy. But, I think the kind of economics combined with the environmental benefits are something that has pretty universal appeal. So it doesn't really matter which direction you're coming from, it makes sense. So, actively discussing, what it would look like to contract with those facilities. And ideally, in a perfect world, we'd be able to work with all three of those existing facilities as well as there's a hydroelectric facility that the water district has, and that's existing generation, obviously, that's there now, and then in the future looking at new generation. Penciling that out is a challenge, and so that's one of the reasons that kind of, I think tipped in favor of saying, oh, it makes sense to do something as a county-wide effort, because, like if Humboldt County went it alone, there's no way they could basically afford to buy power from all three of those facilities, because it would not pencil out to be a cheaper rate than PG&E. And so basically the more customers, the better, to be able to dilute that, higher cost of what our local resources are, and be able to, create jobs and capitalize on those benefits. And so, that was, one of the drivers for folks saying, oh yeah, let's do this together, and we actually can align our priorities. It's not like, oh, Arcata wants renewables, and the board of supervisors want economic development. It's like, oh, those are actually pretty intertwined. And so logistically where we're at, my board approved some revisions to our joint powers agreement that would basically enable us to be the CCA entity. And so those revisions now are going to go out to be approved by all of our member jurisdictions. I think the county, we just scheduled it for October 20-something or other-ish. And they're talking about just putting it on the consent calendar, because like the board of supervisors wants to do this, they don't even need to discuss it at this point. So, and so that's going to be going out to get approved. That's just creating sort of the framework for it, the skeleton. Each jurisdiction also has to pass an ordinance, however they're doing it, whether they're doing it through us or individually. They have to pass an ordinance to say, yes, we're going to create a CCA program, and so that'll be kind of the second phase. Which will be hopefully happening, not quite in parallel, but closely aligned with getting the JPA piece and completed. Hopefully by the end of the year, we'll see. Some of the smaller jurisdictions might straggle, but sometimes they move faster than the bigger jurisdictions. And what other? Oh, and so in parallel to that kind of sort of governance piece of it, of the JPA revisions and the ordinances. We're doing a request for proposals for the service provider, because as mentioned, it's like the economies of scale for us to try to like hire a team is not going to pencil out as well as saying, hey, let's work with folks that are doing this for other communities. We're going to do an RFP so that we're abiding by a good public procurement process, and I don't think we're going to get a huge stack of responses. We'll get at least one, I'm sure. Hopefully 2 or 3. There's some potential that like, for example, one of the existing Sonoma or Marin could say, hey, we'll give you a proposal to not have you join our CCA, but we'll be your back office. And again, I have no idea if they're going to respond, but somebody threw that out there as something that could happen. We'll see, but we're hoping to turn that process around pretty quickly. I'm going to try to finish writing it this weekend, and so we can get it out the door with the target of, I'm hoping we can stay on track to bring it to my board in November for them to say, okay, here's a recommendation for what a service provider to kind of provide that sort of turnkey comprehensive support that he was talking about. And then we're also going to be doing some community kind of more informal town hall meetings. In addition to kind of the city council presentations, which are formal and not always entertaining to go to, and just so have around the county opportunities for people to come and have some pizza and hear about what is CCA and why are you considering this, and how would it work, and since I think probably 99 out of 100 people, if you walk up on the streets of Arcata and you said, what do you think of community choice power? And they'd say, well, community choice aggregation. And they would say, I have no idea what that is and don't know much about it. And it's been in the paper a few times, and it's starting to get some more awareness, but we just want to give people a chance to hear what it is, so that when it comes up for votes, people aren't saying, wait, what is this about? Is this some dicey government thing that's going to cost me more money, and use my tax dollars? And so if we can answer those questions before it comes up, that's a nice way to get things just on the consent calendar and get them moved through, efficiently. So, and answer those questions that the community might have ahead of time. So those are kind of the community outreach, the operational and the governance kind of tracks that we're trying to kind of move somewhat in parallel so that, we can hopefully start serving customers in 2016 if everything can keep moving along.
Can I actually ask a question of you, Matthew? So what kind of programs, renewable programs can you take on with CCA? Like with all this program revenue that RCEA would have in the event that they do CCA?
Yeah, and I think there's a couple that have appeal. Even just the examples from Marin Sonoma. Both of them have 100% renewable option, where you can say, hey, if you want to pay a little bit more on your bill, you can actually choose to have 100% renewables. Typically that's not going to necessarily be cheaper than necessarily what the utility rate is, and that's a fairly common offering. When I was in Denver, that was like something that the utility there just said, hey, if you want to have 100% wind power, it's 2 cents more on your bill. Although it's interesting because that program, just going a little tangent, was actually based off of, so you paid actually more than 2 cents, but then they took away the fuel charge on the bill, so it was actually usually netted out to 2 cents, but it was like, well, this is what the wind costs, and then but you don't pay this part, and so those 2 cents. But at one point, the cost of natural gas, and they also had coal, they mix a lot. Basically, that fuel charge was high enough that the 100% renewable option was actually cheaper than the base option.
Wow.
They only had so much, capacity, and so everyone subscribed, and they got oversubscribed. And, eventually, it crossed back over. But there was a period for at least a few months where it was actually cheaper to be signed up for the 100% renewable option through the utility than their conventional service because of fossil fuel prices. So. That was kind of a fun little moment in time when people were like, oh, maybe this isn't, some lefty, crazy, wacky idea to do renewable energy. Obviously, there's a lot of wind in Colorado. And so having those kind of things where even just beyond the choice of each individual customer being able to say, do I want to stick with PG&E, do I want to go with the CCA, or do I want to go with the CCA and have a 100% renewable option? Mm-hmm. And I should, to give PG&E credit, they're slowly but surely working through the CPUC process to have a 100% renewable option of their own. So even for communities that don't do CCA, there will be that choice where you can say, hey, I want to pay a little bit more to have my power be renewable. And then I think a program that Sonoma has rolled out that has a lot of appeal is a renewable feed-in tariff, which is like community choice aggregation, a unsexy name for a cool thing. I don't know if there's some committee of energy nerds that just tried to come up with the worst possible name for ever cool and they're like, how can we make this sound complicated and unappealing? But basically what it means is for small renewable energy generators, they can feed excess generation into the grid, and there's a tariff, there's a rate that they'll get paid for that power. And so right now, if you over-generate on a solar array in your house, basically the economics of that are pretty abysmal, and there's not really any incentive to build a small generation solar array or small wind turbine or something like that, kind of a community, small individual facility level generation system to size it bigger doesn't make any sense. Whereas through this kind of program, you can get a consistent. They'll say, hey, here's the contract terms. You can get whatever it is, 10 years, 15 years at X cents a kilowatt hour, and it's a competitive rate. And you can take that to a bank and say, hey, will you loan me the money to put solar on my barn roof or to build a dairy digester or whatever that project might be, and I can get this payment from the CCA program, and like I said, Germany's used that to kind of skyrocket the amount of sort of distributed resources, and so that's kind of a neat, fairly straightforward program where you can not just talk about sort of utility scale renewables, but say, hey, if individual customers really want to contribute renewables to the grid, here's a mechanism that makes it really easy and viable for them to do that. So I think that's a pretty exciting opportunity, and then obviously energy efficiency and demand side management, expanding that, and exploring ways to kind of start to push the envelope beyond what kind of a CPUC utility funded model allows for, which, there's a lot of good programs to that, but there's also a lot of constraints, and so having, flexibility there. I've been caveating that with, if we're successful in getting all of our local existing renewable generation facilities on board, we're probably gonna have less money to do cool stuff. I don't think we'll have no money, but at least in the short term, there'll be a tighter margin. So it's kind of well, we want it to work out, but if it doesn't, we'll actually then have, it's kind of a win-win either way. So hey, if it works out, great. We've got a huge 50% potentially local renewable in the mix. if it doesn't work out, well, then we can pursue, these other opportunities in even greater extent. And so it's, I'm not really worried which way it goes. I think we want to have it work out with the biomass facilities, because it does, there's just a lot of jobs. And like I said, it's not just an energy issue, it's really a forestry sector issue that there's people going out of business that depend on those facilities to be there. And so we're definitely working towards that, but it's not the only kind of option for doing local renewables, and it's certainly not going to be the end of it if we do that.
Matthew, what's the generation capacity of those three biomass plants?
Yes, Scotia's 28 megawatts. Fairhaven's 16 or 18, I forget what the net is, and then Blue Lake is 10 net. So, if you look at the output numbers, Fairhaven's the most reliable. So I think Scotia might have actually had less output than Fairhaven, because they haven't been generating in the wintertime. I think all of them could use long-term contracts so they could afford some deferred maintenance upgrades that they haven't been able to make under their kind of current shorter horizon of financing. But the total, if we had 50% if we had 20% opt out, it would be potentially around 50% of the county-wide load, at least based off of 2014 data and the 2013 output from those facilities, as well as the hydro facility, which is just 2 megawatts, so it's pretty small. But it's a pretty substantial chunk if we actually had all three of those in the mix. 2014 was a really low energy use year because it was so warm, so it probably on average be a little bit below 50, but and hopefully we'll have a lower opt-out rate than 20%. I think Sonoma's has been under 10, 8 or something like that.
Yeah, it's trending up just a little bit, but it's nowhere close to 20%.
I thought I heard some talk on possibly expanding the hydro plant. Is that true?
Yeah, that's something that's certainly a potential. It's a pretty old facility, and I cannot speak to whether this is viable or not, but one of the potential things that I know other hydro facilities have looked at is saying, hey, you can kind of upgrade just this, there's already a dam, on Reef Lake, and that's not going in there. It's there for water storage purposes, but there might be opportunities to basically upgrade the generation facility so that it has more output, and so it wouldn't be changing the infrastructure from a river standpoint, but just having an upgraded, more modern generation facility. I don't know if that's really what the benefit or cost benefit of that would be. I know it's been looked at for other hydro facilities that are aging. There's a few other potential small hydro locations that would be not putting in a dam, but run-of-river systems that don't put a barrier in, and then also really the viable locations for that would be anything that's upriver of a natural fish passage barrier. So if you're doing anything in salmon territory, it's see you in 10 years after you're done getting permits, But if there's a waterfall, for example, that salmon obviously can't get past, and that's a natural barrier, then doing anything upriver that has a lot, probably more viability just from a regulatory standpoint. Trick is a lot of those sites are remote, so there's got to be transmission, and the Eurotrack, for example, looked at a couple sites, but they basically were too far from the grid to really make it pencil out. So it's this is a good site for a small hydro run-of-river system up from the waterfall, but to get the power actually anywhere you could use it wasn't really economically appealing. So probably our biggest new generation opportunity would be around, from a large scale, would be wind, and there's onshore wind, but in the longer term, so we're talking 10 years from now, offshore wind, and then even potentially offshore wave power are from just a potential, the magnitude of the energy available in the resource. That's our biggest resource by far. We've got some of the best offshore wind and wave power potential, I think, not just on the West Coast, but in the entire country. And then with the infrastructure out at the old pulp mill, they've got transmission lines there. There's a substation, that's big because there was the pulp mill, which was a huge energy user. And it's already an industrial facility that you could connect basically at that point. And anything out there, it would be like 10 miles off the coast, so it'd be pretty far out from Samoa, which also minimizes the impact to like crab fishing, which is much closer in. The challenge of that though is that you'd need like floating platforms, so it's not necessarily the same as what's the most common, sort of offshore wind turbines. But that's our biggest like long term. If you're going to say, hey, we're going to have 100% renewables, in Humboldt, that's probably the resource that would get us there.
And then I'm not really familiar with all the biomass power plants, but mostly just Samoa is the one I kind of know.
Mm-hmm.
But is there room also to improve those facilities and make them more efficient?
Yeah, they're all pretty old, and
Okay.
and I think there's even potential to kind of upgrade them to more modern gasification systems.
Okay.
So I would say definitely there's issues, and a couple of them have been quite frank that it's like, yeah, we've got a lot of deferred maintenance that would make us more efficient if we could do this, but we haven't been able to justify the investment because our contract's up in a year, we don't know what's happening after that, or now they're have no contracts, and so they kind of need a longer term horizon, and that's one of the the areas where it's like, okay, if the CCA program can say, hey, here's a 10-year contract with a rate that's viable for you, if we can make that pencil out, that lets them have that kind of financial security that they can make those upgrades and those investments.
Okay.
We got a report yesterday in Fresno. I'm on the board of forestry, and